This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacy.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. This week, we share a session from Validation Week on the topic of GXP inspection principles and the changes in processes and expectations resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we recognize that more work is being completed by virtual connections, remote activities, and through systems and processes more reliant on collaborative team efforts and, of course, digital technologies. Understanding how this affects our inspection preparedness, as well as the day-of-audit activities, is critical to a successful site visit, especially given that virtual audits or remote site visits may become part of the new norm. Sharing her thoughts on this topic is Kelly Simpliciano, Associate Director at Bristol-Myers Squibb.
Yes, my name is Kelly Simpliciano. I am an Associate Director within the Clinical Trials Systems and Auditing Quality Assurance Group at Bristol-Myers Squibb. It's my is that I'm a clinical auditor, regionally based for the Americas team. That being said, I perform internal process audits such as system audits, audits of vendors, and audits of clinical investigator sites. I also get involved in supporting inspections, whether a site inspection, where as the sponsor we support the site, or during a sponsor monitor inspection. Early in the pandemic, I was actually requested to come on site for an inspection on site, and I was the scribe for that inspection. Previous 10 years in computer system validation of clinical systems, and that was the role where I was first interviewed by the FDA to speak about a validation plan and summary for a specific system. I think at that point is when I first really got interested in the whole inspection process, and I spent a lot of extra time in the back room just observing everything that went on for the inspection. I then spent 5 years in the IT quality department supporting clinical IT compliance and performing audits. And then I continued to have direct contact with inspectors during that time in that group. And I just want to remind you that these are my views and not necessarily those of Bristol-Myers. And before we get into the agenda, there is a poll. So if you could respond to that, great, so I can understand your experience. And I will also take a break every once in a while to take a look in between slides, to take a look at the chat to see if there's any questions as I go, if we can keep this as interactive as possible in a virtual environment. Okay, so today's agenda. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about some background information on how the health authorities have reacted and adapted to COVID-19 with their inspection approach. I will also provide some examples of what has and hasn't changed for inspection readiness and mostly inspection management for sponsors. I will cover some specific points about logistics during a remote or hybrid inspection, however you end up setting it up. And I also will talk a little bit for the future with inspection management. I also just want to provide the caveat that my experience is GCP and BIMO, and so my examples will be based on those. However, many of the items that I'll talk about do apply to the GXPs, so I expect that will be beneficial to those in other areas. And we also had I recently attended a session at my company where people shared experiences from GL inspections, and the same common theme. inspection. Each health authority and even each sponsor probably has different terms: remote inspection or remote assessment. The distance assessments, the MHRA office-based inspections. The FDA uses the terms alternative methods and remote regulations. I personally like the definition from the EMA guidance displayed here, because it explains the process of conducting the remote assessment, as well as indicating that it's not the typical approach, right? That the typical approach review of records. So I'll go into a little bit more detail for each major health authority to provide some background in the MHRA. So in March of 2020, the MHRA announced that they would only conduct on-site inspections for high risk and where they could not do a remote assessment for the applicant. It was not until January of 2021 they suspended their on-site inspection program, and then were able to resume that in March of 2021. For their office-based inspections, they have a very defined flow where they expect the inspections to occur. So they want the organizations to provide electronic copies of documents. They expect teleconferences, follow-up, and postpone anything that really can only be on site until their next inspection. The EMA. So the EMA published their guidance in October of 2020, and they did revise it in May of 2021. I do have all of these references contained within the presentation too, which may be helpful for you. The EMA has very, very specific recommendations about sharing lists of its access to systems. They download themselves and have access to anything they consider part of the trial master file themselves. They also request a shared electronic form, and if it can't be shared real time, they want it to be shared at regular intervals throughout the. It's also interesting. EMA recommends a tool for conferencing and chatting, which I know really would feel comfortable having a chat option with the inspectors. That's difficult too, but that is something that they recommend. So if you're with the EMA, you want to make sure people are well trained and the use of a chat function if you're able to enable that with the EMA. The EMA also has a feasibility assessment where they even the remote inspection is possible, and the remote inspection is possible, then they go through the preparation phases and the execution as I detailed prior. It is important to note that the EMA does not consider remote inspection investigator sites feasible. This has a lot to do with the burden to the site, the data protection, and the ability to have system access. Next, FDA. The temporarily postponed domestic and foreign routine final inspections in March of 2020, and then they began by July of 2020. The are pretty good. They were able to complete 800-ish critical inspections within that first year after the beginning of the pandemic. It's a much lower number than usual. They also issued their guidance much later compared to the EMA and the MHRA. They didn't publish guidance until May of 2021, but they did actually incorporate it within that already best practice within it's already published from other health authorities. Remote evaluation, it does not include a formal form FDA 2 like a typical inspection does. Review of systems. It may include a view of the facility via live stream or video, and they will evaluate for that. Also, similar to the EMA, the FDA has a risk-based approach for even inspections, which are mission critical. And they're looking at things like the type of applications. So if it's a breakthrough therapy or a serious disease, something related to the drug shortage list, they're going to prioritize those inspections for either remote assessment or on-site. And then, of course, they're still going to look at for cause, as well as pre-approval and pre-license inspections. The domestic has no bearing on their risk prioritization, which is something important to consider in terms of, COVID. Use alternative tools and approaches instead of doing action. They view the previous compliance history of the entity, whether it be a sponsor or investigator or right. They also evaluate, in the case of a sponsor, that application and the risks, determine the need for an inspection. And like I said, they could do some remote evaluation, and they have significantly increased their record request that they're able to enact based on legislation. They don't consider methods, if they have to enact them, equivalent to an inspection. Consider on-site the gold standard. And as I mentioned previously, the number of inspections have definitely decreased. However, their enforcement is only down 20%. So they are being effective, even though they are not performing site inspections. Let's take a pause to see how we're doing on the poll. Was everybody able to poll? And maybe if you could show the results of the poll. Okay. Well, 100% experience during. So it's good to have that feedback from the audience. If you have specific questions as I go forward, please don't hesitate to ask. So we want to think about, okay, what hasn't changed for sponsors with this COVID environment of inspections, right? With some on-site, some remote, some hybrid. What really hasn't changed? So we still need to prioritize key studies for inspection readiness. We still need to audit those high processes. We also need to be prepared to discuss the impact of COVID-19. Specifically for clinical, there is a requirement to summarize the impact of COVID-19 in the clinical study report. But I'm sure that this applies to every GXP to be prepared to speak about this during the inspection. They're going to ask you. So it's not like anything has changed. If it was it's almost as if it was an issue that occurred during your study. How are you managing it, right? You still need to have robust inspection management processes and tools. You may need to improve and change those tools, but you still need to have those in place. You still need to assemble an inspection support team quickly. And that way that team is structured might be a little bit different, and we'll talk about that. And of course, industry collaboration is crucial. I know my management participates in linking leaders, and different conferences like this are a great way to get intelligence from other organizations to find out, what they've experienced and how are they managing it, right? So let's compare the difference between on-site and remote inspections. So when you're on-site, I think most people, if you've been involved in inspection before, you're physically in the room with the inspectors. And your front room, your people in the front room with the inspector are there. And then you have a physical back room with people supporting those in the front room and coordinating with the SMEs. And in a room, not only is everyone either remote, or there are some hybrid cases, right, where maybe only a small subset of the team is on site, but you're not even co-located with your team. So those two inspectors who came on site, they could easily have a little side conversation during the inspection, which when they're remote is a lot more challenging, right? Because then they have to actually type it, or they have to ask for a pause so they can have that side conversation, versus when you're in the room with them, they could just be like, hold on one second, and then they discuss amongst themselves, right? So there is a completely different dynamic to the fact that the inspectors are probably not even going to be co-located if there's more than one. And the same thing goes for your support teams, right? So you have these virtual front and back rooms that now have to chat with each other on tools like Microsoft Teams. They have to have, different ways of processing the communication flow throughout the inspection. And it's not like before where you might have had runners going back between the different rooms, right? Previously, or usually on-site inspections, anytime you have an interview, that person is face-to-face with the inspector, right? There were times when someone was located, if you have a global company, someone was located in a different office, so you did bring them in on a teleconference or a video conference. But for the most part, you called the person a lot of times on their cell phone and said they needed to be there in person to support the inspection. With remote, everyone is teleconference or video conference for interviews, right? In terms of document exchange, it really depended on the health authority. Sometimes they had direct access. Sometimes you were handing them a USB stick with their requests. Sometimes you were printing items for them. With remote, you have to figure out, okay, how are we going to exchange information with this health authority, right? And as you saw on the previous slides, how you do that, it is very different based on the different health authority requirements, right? They all have their specific preferences, as well as their own specific styles, right? So even though you might get an inspector from an EMA who wants direct access, some of those inspectors may be more IT savvy than others, and you may have time to help some out more. In terms of the tour, it was easy to walk people around, right, on an on-site inspection. But for remote inspections, there's a couple approaches that have been taken. Sometimes you'll see recorded tours of key areas. You may see also live tours with technology, like something like a smart goggle of that nature. And in terms of the system access, it really is dependent on the health authority, because I think that continues to be, much the modality. It's more around the health authority preference on whether or not they request direct access or guided access. So we'll talk about a little bit about that next. So first and foremost, you want to ensure easy access. You don't want the inspectors to get frustrated when trying to gain access to your systems, whether it be your electronic trial master file that they're getting direct access to, or if it's just your document exchange system, like a box.com type of utility information. You don't want them to feel like they are losing time with system access, and you want to make sure you test all of that ahead of time. Also need to not only consider, your sponsor systems, but as well as your vendor ones as well. The MHRA and the EMA inspectors request direct access, and those systems that they would request access should already have accounts built into the design and the validation of the system. And that needs to consider things like, are we going to let them download? Are we let them print? Because then you lose control of what they have looked at, right? So if you put something into that system, so you know what they viewed, what they printed, that's great. You can attach that report as part of your inspection documentation. But that's something that does typically get tracked, through the request process of an inspection. So you don't want to lose that ability. They have direct system. Also, we typically see that the FDA inspectors accept guided demos, and in order to support that, you really need to have knowledgeable system users to perform the tasks that they're requesting to see. Those users actually have to have access to that data available. So you don't want to have your protocol manager or trial manager, or whatever terminology you use, being the one to display how a system is used by the monitor if they don't have the right level of access that the monitor would have. You also want to make sure that whoever's in the room when you're doing demos is allowed to see the information based on that system, that it's aligned with that security model of that system, and that you're not unblinding anything. Usually at that point during an inspection, data has, but you want to be cautious of that, because it can vary at what point they come to inspect. And you always want to prepare your demo in advance and perform a walkthrough with your quality department. And in terms of whether or not your systems are inspection ready, you want to make sure, like I said, that you have access to those vendor systems, that there's always the ability to show your systems are PAR 11 compliant, and that you can show the audit trail. And we really recommend that you have system flows or diagrams available, because that helps digest the information in a much quicker way. Again. Okay, perfect. An inspection, remember, or maybe one you'd like to forget. So if we go through the process, you want to be able to write the play. You need to have a plan, tools in place for conducting remote inspections, just like if it was on site. But the difference is you're going to have different tools for document exchange, meeting, communicating both externally and internally, correct? And then you also need to think about, if you're using new technology, that you pilot that and you test that. And I would highly recommend having a consistent approach as much as possible across the GXPs. It'll help with interoperability if you maybe pull somebody from the GMP team to help with the GCP inspection. It'll also help improve your overall inspection tools because you're investing in something that can be used across the entire company. Your cast. So the inspectors, maybe the star of the show, right? Or the audience, maybe we consider them the audience, but because, when you think about who's really the star of the inspection, you think about your inspection coordinators. Those people need to be really responsible for organizing the inspection team, all the logistics, all the communication with the inspectors. You want to have someone that is able to build a rapport with the inspection from the very beginning or early on in the process. Keep that relationship active. And you may have an inspection management team at larger companies, but at smaller companies, you may have to assign people the different roles, as ad hoc in addition to their regular day job. And, as an auditor, I do get assigned to be a role in inspection ad hoc, which is in addition to my regular day job. So when you're looking to assign those back and front room coordinators, you really want your A team to be the leads of those rooms. And then you can bring newer people on that can be guided by others. But it is good to have an experienced team. You want people who are able to multitask. It's also good if you have experience with study being inspected, but if you just understand the processes really well, it's good to also, it's okay if you don't have study experience, right? You can lean on those who do have it, because these folks are the ones who are, making sure that the requests are well understood, that they are provided by the SMEs, the subject matter experts, in a timely manner, and that they are QC'd, that they make sense, that they answer the question being asked, that any risks associated with the answer are understood, etc. So your SMEs are very important to identify. There may be multiple people within an organization who can speak about a particular process, right? You want to make sure that those people that are going to be in front of the inspector are competent and have the ability to perform under stress, and that they have a good demeanor and attitude. You want to make sure that they're available for the duration of the inspection. One of the things to consider for remote inspections is that we always had someone setting up meetings with the SMEs in an administrative, type of support. But it does become more challenging if you have to invite, external parties like the inspectors, or if you have to manage some of the things within the platform, like muting participants or making sure the right screen is being shared, right? So sometimes you want that person to be available throughout the inspection so that they can manage all those other things without being distracted with other things, like if they're an SME and they have to respond to a request. The other thing that we found out, and again, early on in the pandemic, there was a lot to coordinate legal in order to even go on site. When I first went on site, I had a letter from my legal department that I had to carry with me, that said I was okay to, be on the road and go into work, right? So all of those conversations needs to happen if you have a hybrid inspection where some people are on site and some are remote. You also want to look to set the stage. So it's very important, like I said, to have a conversation with the inspectors to discuss logistics. Are they okay with teleconferences? Would they prefer video conferences? Is there a time zone difference? Are there translations needed? If documents are in, not even just the dialogue, but if documents are in the native language, do those require translation? Those are all very important things to understand, because you don't want to be asking that question when you get the request, for a monitoring report for a site in France, and it's, in French, right? So, you can also use questionnaires to determine the requirements of the inspectorate. As I went through, there's some very specific ones for each agency. But you can go through and confirm or have them fill out a form to confirm those things. And, like we talked about, you need to have a viable and secure file sharing system that they're able to use. You also want to prepare document and data extracts. So you may want to pre-organize some information if you have some stuff in paper that you feel is going to be important or is part of what they typically ask for. You may want to start scanning some of those things. You might want to check your scanned documents to make sure they're all readable, things like that. We talked about pre-recorded videos of operations for highly inspected areas. And it's very important to set expectations with SMEs for document requests. This is not anything new, but it's always an area that's difficult and struggle. So you want to make sure they understand the format of the files that they're providing, whether it's view only or sortable. You want to make sure that anything that they provide you is labeled according to internal procedure, getting it from like the source system, that they're citing the source of the system, right? And that they're returning document requests, a very quick base turnaround time, and that they're making sure that they understand what's actually being requested. So get to opening night, we want to rehearse, we want to test everything. We want to test our audio, our visual, our system access, file sharing mechanisms, and we want to prepare those interviewees for the environment. We want them to introduce themselves when speaking. If everyone is on teleconference, it's very difficult to understand who is speaking for the scribe and for the inspector. So if you just say, every time you go to say something and say, oh, this is Kelly, right? And that way that it helps the flow of the interview. And you want to make sure that people are actually looking at the inspector, right? That they're not over here, over there, right? That they're looking dead on during the discussion. So if they have slides, you want it to be set up in a way that it appears as if they're still looking at the inspector. It's trying to maintain that eye contact and that connection. Okay, so in terms of opening night, hopefully our critics are impressed. So a lot of inspectors will want all the attendees for presentation. You have that available in advance with their name, their title. Some inspectors will automatically just request their CV, sometimes even their training. So make sure you have all of that ready to go for opening night, or you confirm the expectations with the inspectors, right? Your front room and back room is ready to go. You have your viewers. There may be certain people from management or trainers that are just viewing what's going on. You have to let the inspectors know if you are doing that, right? If you have extra people there, but it's because they need to know who's in the room. But it is an option that's helpful. If you need to conduct like via video, one thing that was considered really helpful is to provide the facility or the room for orientation, so that if you're going from room to room, the inspector can orient themselves as to where you're going. And anytime that you have any kind of technology involved, like you want to make sure you have alternate equipment available in case something happens. Intermission is very important. Again, when you're on site, it's very natural to be like, okay, we're going to take a break. We're going to go get some coffee. We're going to go to the ladies' room or the gentleman's room. You know, it's a very natural flow. When you're remote, people forget to add the breaks in, and it even happens on remote audits, right? So it's just, as the coordinator, someone of the inspection coordinators say, okay, would you like a break? And especially if interviews are running over, you want to say, okay, do you want to continue, or would you like a break? And then we'll start back up. So you also have to make sure everybody is flexible to allow for those breaks as well if things, if sessions do go over. So hopefully the reviews are good. You don't get a finding, but you always want to try to learn from the inspection, right? So you can also, the inspectors provide some feedback, and we always conduct an internal lessons learned. On a couple of the inspections I worked on, we actually did that real time, where in the notebook that we were using for the inspection, we had a tab where anybody who was involved could just enter the as they went. And it really made it helpful to put their notes down while they thought of it. They might refine it later, but it was something that they remembered real time. So next, hopefully the slide advances. What does the future of inspection management look like? So we know what our risks are for sponsors. There's technology challenges, various vendors involved, the ability to have staff on site, SME training on inspection management. Those risks, maybe the technology challenges has increased a little bit more with remote inspections, but and the ability to have people on site, but those probably existed even before remote inspections, right? But we want to look to see, okay, where can we bring efficiencies? Where can we improve access to systems? How can we make it easier to get access to those systems? What types of technologies can we enable to optimize management? Can we leverage global support so that if you have SMEs working on something while they're asleep, you could maybe have the colleagues in Europe work on something and then provide it back to a US-based inspection team, or vice versa. Consider a hybrid situation where we have some people on site so that you can get them together safely to support the inspection. We have efficiencies in terms of our environmental aspect by printing less. So with everything being teleconferences and video conferences, especially to train silent observers, right? So we can get more people to see what it's like to be in, where usually those front and back rooms, when they're physical, are very right? And I think, you know, in terms of transparency, we always want to share information about risks and quality issues with inspectors, you know, with caution. But you don't want to hide those things. The inspectors want to, bad things are going to happen. They want to know how you handled them. And they want you to explain how you handled them. It's important to have a good communication and common understanding with their expectations, and they expect requests. And another thing that's coming out with the transparency is inspections uploaded to the email. So that's going to be a new thing for in terms of the transparency of who's been expected when. What does that mean to sponsors? We should still continue our activities. Our inspection tools and accounts should be tested during audits and mock inspections as much as possible. That's our chance to really make sure that everything is working as expected. Continue to pursue and adopt technology, but we also want to make sure we have support for that technology. If we don't support for that tech, it's going to not go well during the inspection. We want to make sure we open lines of communication with the health authority in the submission process. Sometimes those regulatory folks need to be speaking with the quality organization to make sure they understand, okay, what the health authority, what are the things they're asking about with this submission, so that we're prepared at inspection readiness activities. We should continue with quick turnaround time for requests. When you have vendors, you need to make contracts and your agreement also provide things in a quick manner, because it's always going to take a little bit longer for vendors because they're going to provide something, and as a sponsor, you're going to want to look at it. We really need to think about how can we manage this, and how can we make this better.
Once again, we thank our expert speaker, Kelly Simpliciano, for sharing her expertise. I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. Most importantly, thank you to you, our valued listeners. We really appreciate you tuning in each week. And with your help, we saw tremendous growth in 2021. Please remember to share this episode with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review in your podcast player of choice. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you on that. And if you like this training style episode, please visit www.shop.ivtnetwork.com/product for a complete list of available training videos, on-demand webinars, and industry tools. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, make it a great week.